This session is entitled Enhancing Capabilities, Building Capacities. There are many elements of that. In the interest of time and recognizing the diversity of experienced speakers on the panel, I will limit myself to the resource dimension of this challenge. You've heard from General Guastella, and we have General Al-Advan can talk about operational issues, and two very excellent representatives of industry here, and Martin and Rudy. So I'm somewhat confident I can just take on one piece of this. The program that your association has put in front of you in the middle has a sentence that's very important. It was alluded to very cryptically just as we were doing the transition. And it reads, the commitment of the European NATO members to meet the 2% threshold of their GDP for defense spending, even in a time of financial constraints and growing technology cost, is essential to guarantee the interoperability and crisis management operations both among allies and with partners. And my government obviously believes that's fundamentally the case. That was fundamentally the case before Paris. It's fundamentally even more the case after Paris. You have seen President Hollande himself point out the necessity for increased defense spending to respond to the challenge, indeed the state of war that France now finds itself in. My point in making this presentation today is simply to try to ensure that you have a proper perspective on what this pledge solemnly taken by 28 heads of state at Wales a year and a half ago was and what it was not. My concern is that it gets reduced incorrectly to a cartoon that just has the number 2% on it. And to an extent, 2% has become a shorthand for referring to the pledge, but it would be a mistake for you as members of ATA or those in the media to define the pledge exclusively and strictly in those terms. Let me explain. The pledge, which you can read, it's in public documents, starts out very clearly by saying, taking current commitments into account. Those words were very carefully chosen, added, I might say, at the insistence of Denmark. I know Denmark's ATA chapter is here today. Denmark, because Denmark had legislated its defense budget into law in the Folketing, and was due to drop for the next several years. So the Danes said, we can't take a pledge that we can't meet. So we realized that in some cases countries were fixed in their defense budgets going down before they could go up. But taking that into account, the Danish exception, if you will, the heads of state promised two things of real importance. First, and I think this is really the most important, operative, immediately important part of the pledge. It reads, allies whose current proportion of GDP spent on defense is less than 2% will do certain things. Now, I think all of you know that very few of the 28 NATO allies are at 2%. Today it is 5, the United States, UK, Estonia, Greece, and Poland, with 2 right on the cusp, France and Turkey. So if you round off, let's say they're about 7 or 1/4 of the alliance where you want to be. And for the rest, for the other 3/4, this is what the commitment from heads of state requires. 1, halt any decline in defense expenditure. It doesn't say tomorrow, next year, in 2020, in a decade. It says immediately halt any further cuts. In other words, stop the hemorrhaging. So if you're writing a story or making an assessment of how we are doing on this pledge, the first question you should ask is not how many have gotten to 2%, I'll come to that in a minute. It should be how many halted the declines in their defense budgets for those who were below 2% of GDP. And the interesting news, and I think the unreported news, is that of the 23 in that category, 15 have done so since Wales. And our projection for next year, by the time of the summit, is that NATO will be able to say that 21 out of the 23 allies who were below 2% at Wales have halted the decline in their defense budget. That is a good news story that gives you some confidence about the alliance. Now, in some cases, these upticks are modest, but at least the vector is going in the right direction. So what about the 2% then? What exactly was pledged on 2%? And here, too, the words are very important. They pledged to aim to move towards the 2% guideline within a decade, with a view to meeting their NATO capability targets and filling NATO's capability shortfalls. So for these 23 who started out below 2% at Wales, their objective, their pledge is to aim to move over 10 years to get to 2%. And we certainly hope and will encourage all to get to 2% within 10 years. But it would be a mistake to give NATO a failing grade tomorrow because only 7 of 28 are at or near 2%. Give us time, we're working on it. Last, and I'll close on this, Julian. The debate that preceded this pledge, and this pledge was a hard-fought accomplishment to get consensus at NATO. Many allies early in the negotiations believed passionately that it wasn't how much money you spent, but how wisely you spent the money. And of course, we have to be smart in how we spend the money, if for no other reason than we owe it to the taxpayers who provide the money. But there comes a point where when defense resources have dwindled so far that you cannot maintain force structure commensurate with the foreign capabilities and security commitments you're taking on, that no matter how smartly you could spend the money, it won't be sufficient. I'll close with a reference to an old TV ad that those of you that lived in the United States probably saw many times by one of our beer companies. It didn't compare with Belgian beer, of course, Admiral Rosier, but it was called Miller Lite, which was a really light beer. And this ad would feature about 40,000 people in a football stadium, and half of them on one side would chant, "Taste great." The other half would chant, "Less filling." The idea of the ad was to suggest that only one of those could be correct, that either this beer, you bought the beer because you didn't get fat, or you got it because it was so tasty. But of course, the point of the marketing was to say it is both. It is both. And that's what the pledge is. We had to spend smarter, and we had to have more to spend.